My father signed a Do Not Resuscitate order at 10:47 p.m. on a Thursday, not because I was dying, not because doctors said there was no hope, but because someone in billing told him saving me would cost too much. I'm Rachel Morgan, 32 years old, trauma nurse from Seattle, and I survived that decision, but barely, and only because someone broke the rules to keep me alive. The betrayal of that DNR? It wasn't even the worst thing he did. While I was in a coma, unconscious and fighting for my life, my father committed fraud so calculated, so shocking, that when I finally uncovered the truth, I knew I couldn't just walk away. The bank had already flagged the mortgage, and we had a 72-hour window before the funds were permanently distributed. I had to expose him, and fast. What happened next destroyed his reputation, his career, his marriage, and every lie he'd built his life on. And I watched it all collapse with a clarity that only comes when you've been betrayed by the person who was supposed to protect you. I was 31 when the accident happened, and I work as a trauma nurse in Seattle, which means I've seen people fight for their lives when no one else believed they could make it. But I never thought I'd become one of those cases, lying in a hospital bed with machines breathing for me while my own father stood in the billing office saying, "Let her go, we won't pay for this." He signed that DNR at 10:47 p.m., not because the doctors told him I was gone, not because there was no hope, but because someone in accounting said a number that scared him more than losing me. I couldn't believe it when I found out months later. The truth hit me like a second crash, and this time there were no airbags. They told me I'd been in a coma for 11 days after the accident, that my brain was swelling, that I needed emergency surgery, or I'd die within hours. My father, Richard Morgan, sat in that waiting room with his calculator app open, adding up ICU costs, surgical fees, rehabilitation projections. Like I was a broken car he was deciding whether to total or repair. He didn't cry, he didn't pray, he didn't even ask if there was a chance I'd wake up and recognize him again. Instead, he pulled the attending physician aside and said, "If she's not going to be the same, I'm not signing anything that puts me in debt for the rest of my life." That's when he signed the Do Not Resuscitate order, the ultimate betrayal disguised as a difficult decision. But here's the shocking part. I didn't die because someone broke the rules. Patricia Delgado, the head nurse on my floor and one of my closest friends from nursing school, found my healthcare proxy buried in my employee file after my father had already left the hospital that night. She called Deborah Cole, my former mentor, and the person I'd named as my medical proxy 3 years earlier when I updated my paperwork after my grandma warned me, "Never let your father make choices for you when you can't speak." Deborah drove 40 minutes in the rain, walked into that ICU at 2:18 a.m., revoked the DNR in front of 2 witnesses, and told the neurosurgeon, "Do whatever it takes, I'll sign everything." That surgery saved my life, and my father had no idea until I woke up 3 weeks later, and he had to pretend he'd been by my side the whole time. I grew up being treated like a living bill, a reminder of everything my father didn't want to spend. While my sister Natalie got a brand new Lexus for her 21st birthday, I got a lecture about how my childhood asthma had cost them thousands in medications and specialists. Every time I needed something, school supplies, a winter coat, a ride to work when my car broke down, he'd sigh and pull out this little notebook where he tracked every cent he'd ever spent on me since I was born. He'd say, "You know, Natalie never cost us this much," and my mother would just look away like she'd heard it 1,000 times and stopped caring. I was the daughter who came with receipts, the one whose existence was measured in copays and interest rates, and no matter how hard I worked or how much I tried to prove I was worth something, I was always just another expense in his ledger. My grandmother Lillian was the only person who ever made me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't some cosmic mistake that drained the family budget. She'd sneak me $20 bills and say, "This is yours, not his," and she'd tell me stories about standing up to my grandfather when he tried to control her with money. The last time I saw her, 2 weeks before she died, she held my hand so tight it hurt and said, "Rachel, listen to me. There's a lawyer named Kessler, Donald Kessler, and when the time comes, he'll find you." I didn't understand what she meant. I thought maybe the medication was making her confused, but she repeated it 3 more times until I promised I'd remember the name. She passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, and my father cried at the funeral, but I saw him on his phone during the service, probably calculating how much the casket cost. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined even in my worst nightmares, was that my father wasn't just emotionally checked out. He wasn't just a man who saw his daughter as a financial burden and chose money over her life when she was unconscious and dying. I thought the DNR was the worst thing he'd done, but I had no idea the real crime was still waiting to find me. What he did while I was in that coma, while Deborah was fighting to keep me alive and Patricia was monitoring every vital sign, was so much worse than signing a DNR. He committed a crime that would unravel his entire life in 72 hours, and the karma that followed was more brutal than any revenge I could have ever planned. When I finally opened my eyes after 3 weeks in that hospital bed, the first thing I saw was my father's face hovering over me, and he looked relieved, not because I was alive, but because I was awake enough to hear his version of the story. He immediately started talking about how he'd never left my side, how he'd fought for me every single day, how the doctors had wanted to give up, but he refused to let them. I was too weak to speak, too confused to process what was real and what wasn't, but somewhere deep in my gut I felt this gnawing sense that something was wrong, that the man squeezing my hand and crying fake tears was performing for an audience I couldn't see. Patricia walked in 30 minutes later, saw him, and her entire face changed. She looked at him the way you'd look at someone who just got away with murder. It took another week before I was strong enough to ask questions, and that's when Patricia sat on the edge of my bed and told me the truth that would shatter every illusion I had left. She pulled out her phone and showed me the time-stamped incident report from the night my father signed the DNR, the exact time Deborah arrived, the notes from the surgeon who'd been told to stop prepping me for the operating room. "Rachel, he walked away," Patricia said, her voice shaking with anger she'd been holding in for weeks. "He signed that paper, told the attending you weren't worth the cost, and then he left the hospital and didn't come back for 4 days." I felt my chest tighten, not from the injuries but from the humiliation of realizing my own father had tried to let me die to avoid a bill. But here's where the betrayal gets even darker, where the story shifts from emotional cruelty to actual crime. While I was unconscious, while Deborah was signing consent forms and Patricia was monitoring my vitals every 2 hours, my father went to a notary public in Tacoma with forged documents. He'd created a power of attorney that claimed I'd signed over all legal authority to him 3 days before the accident, even though I'd been at work that entire week and never signed anything. With that fake POA, he went to the county recorder's office and transferred my grandmother's house, the house she'd left to me in her will, the house that was supposed to be my safety net, into his own name, claiming he was acting on my behalf as my legal representative. Then he did something even more shocking, something that proves he'd been planning this for months, maybe even before my grandmother died. He took that fraudulent deed, walked into a mortgage office, and took out a $295,000 home equity loan against my house, the house that wasn't even legally his. He used my coma as the perfect cover story, telling the loan officer that he needed the money for my medical bills, that he was a devoted father making sacrifices to save his daughter's life. All of it happened within the same metro area, Seattle, Tacoma, Everett, close enough that he could move between them without raising suspicion. They believed him because he's a deacon at Shoreline Baptist, because he's known in the community as this upstanding Christian man who volunteers and donates and preaches about family values every Sunday. He cashed that check, paid off his own credit card debt, bought Natalie a down payment for her condo, and pocketed the rest. I found out about all of this because Donald Kessler finally found me, just like my grandmother said he would. He showed up at my hospital room 6 weeks after I woke up, carrying a leather briefcase and looking like he'd been waiting his entire career for this moment. "Rachel, my name is Donald Kessler, and I was your grandmother's estate attorney," he said, sitting down in the chair my father had pretended to sleep in. "Lillian made me promise that if anything ever happened to you, if your father ever tried to take what she left you, I'd intervene. He opened that briefcase and pulled out the original will, the real deed to the house with my name on it dated 2 years before she died, and a handwritten letter from my grandma that started with, "If you're reading this, it means Richard has done exactly what I feared he would." Kessler explained that the house had been transferred to me legally while my grandmother was still alive, that she'd recorded the deed with the county clerk to make sure my father couldn't contest it after she was gone. The power of attorney my father used was a forgery, which meant the second deed transfer was void, which meant the mortgage he took out was fraudulent. The moment he signed those papers, he committed multiple felonies, Kessler said, sliding a folder across my hospital tray. Wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, mortgage fraud. We're talking federal charges if the bank decides to press it. I sat there, still recovering from a traumatic brain injury, still processing the fact that my father had signed a DNR to let me die. And now I was learning he'd also stolen my inheritance and committed crimes in my name while I was fighting for my life. I spent my entire childhood believing I was the problem, that I was the reason our family struggled, that every sacrifice my parents made was somehow my fault. My father would sit at the dinner table and say things like, "If Rachel hadn't needed braces, we could have remodeled the kitchen," or, "Natalie's college fund would be bigger if we hadn't spent so much on Rachel's medical bills when she was little." He'd say it casually, like he was commenting on the weather, and my mother would just nod and serve him more potatoes. I was 8 years old the first time I heard him call me the expensive one, and I remember going to my room and trying to calculate how much money I'd cost them, wondering if there was a way I could pay them back and finally be worth something. Natalie, my sister, got everything I didn't: approval, investment, celebration, pride. When she graduated high school, they threw her a party with 200 people and a live band. When I graduated with honors and a nursing school acceptance letter, my father took us to Applebee's and spent the whole dinner talking about how much Natalie's law school applications were going to cost. When she turned 25, they bought her a car with a bow on it and posted pictures on Facebook with captions like, "So proud of our successful daughter." When I turned 25, I got a card with $50 in it and a note that said, "Hope this helps with your loans." Every milestone, every achievement, every moment I thought might finally make him see me as something other than a liability. He'd find a way to remind me I was still in the red. I started working at 16, not because I wanted pocket money, but because I couldn't stand asking my father for anything anymore. Every time I needed gas money or lunch money or money for a school trip, he'd make me sit down and listen to a lecture about budgeting and responsibility, and then he'd write the amount in his little notebook with the date and a running total. By the time I was 18, I'd stopped asking for help entirely. I worked 2 jobs through nursing school, ate ramen for dinner most nights, and wore scrubs I bought secondhand because I refused to give him another reason to call me a burden. I thought if I could just become financially independent, if I could just prove I didn't need him, maybe he'd finally respect me. But no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I achieved, I was still the daughter who'd been expensive as a child, and that label followed me everywhere. When I bought my first car with my own money, he said, "Good, now I don't have to worry about you asking for rides." When I got my nursing license and started making decent money, he said, "Finally pulling your weight, huh?" When I told him I was saving for a down payment on a house, he laughed and said, "With your credit? Good luck." Every accomplishment was met with a dismissal. Every success was reframed as me finally catching up to where I should have been all along. And I started to believe that maybe he was right. Maybe I was just inherently deficient, always behind, never quite enough. My grandmother saw all of it, every moment of humiliation, every casual cruelty, every time my father made me feel like I owed the family a debt just for existing. She'd pull me aside at holiday dinners and say, "Rachel, he's wrong about you, you know that, right?" And I'd nod, but deep down I wasn't sure. She was the one who paid for my nursing school textbooks when I couldn't afford them, the one who slipped me grocery money when she knew I was skipping meals, the one who told me, "You're not a burden, baby. You're a gift. And someday you'll understand why I'm telling you this." I didn't understand. Not until I was lying in that hospital bed and Kessler handed me her letter, the one where she wrote, "I've watched Richard treat you like a debt for 30 years, and I won't let him take the one thing I can give you to break free." That letter was the first time someone put into words what I'd felt my entire life but couldn't articulate. That my father didn't just fail to love me, he actively resented me. And that resentment had calcified into something dangerous. She wrote about how he'd tried to convince her not to leave me the house, how he'd argued that Natalie deserved it more because she'd made better choices, how he'd even suggested my grandmother sell the house and split the money between him and my aunt instead. "I said no," she wrote, "because I know what he'll do if he gets control of anything that's yours, and I won't let him erase you the way he's tried to erase your value your whole life." Reading that, I realized the DNR wasn't a panicked decision made under stress. It was the logical conclusion of a lifetime of seeing me as expendable. The accident happened on a Thursday afternoon in October, one of those rare Seattle days where the sky is clear and you can actually see the mountains. I was driving home from a double shift at the hospital, exhausted but relieved to have 3 days off ahead of me, when a semi-truck ran a red light at the intersection of Aurora and 95th. I remember the sound, metal crunching, glass exploding, my own voice screaming, and then nothing, just darkness and silence for 11 days. The paramedics told me later that I'd technically died twice in the ambulance, that they'd shocked me back both times, that by the time I got to the ER, my brain was hemorrhaging and the trauma team was debating whether I'd ever wake up. My father got the call at 4:32 p.m., and according to Patricia, he showed up at the hospital around 6:15, which means he stopped somewhere for an hour and 43 minutes before coming to see if his daughter was alive. When he finally arrived, he didn't go to my room. He went straight to the billing office to ask about insurance coverage, out-of-pocket maximums, and what happens to medical debt if the patient dies. The woman at the desk, who later testified about this in a deposition, said he asked her point blank, "If she doesn't make it, am I responsible for the charges?" She thought he was in shock, that grief was making him say strange things. But then he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the cost estimates she'd printed out. 3 days into my coma, the doctors told my father I needed emergency brain surgery to relieve the pressure and stop the bleeding, that without it, I'd be dead within 12 hours. He asked how much it would cost, and when they said the surgery alone was $65,000 before anesthesia and post-op care, he said, "And what if we don't do it?" The neurosurgeon, Dr. Patel, was stunned. He later told me he'd never had a family member ask that question unless the patient was already brain dead or 90 years old. "She's 31, Dr. Patel said. She has a chance. We just need to act fast." My father nodded, said he needed to think about it and pray. And then he went home and didn't answer his phone for 6 hours. That's when he signed the DNR, sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight, after the hospital had called him 4 times begging for consent to operate. He came back to the hospital alone, didn't bring Natalie, didn't bring my mother, didn't bring anyone who might question what he was about to do. He sat down with the attending physician and said, "I've prayed about this, and I think we need to let God's will be done, which means no extraordinary measures." The doctor asked if he understood that no extraordinary measures meant I'd die, and my father said, "I understand, and I'm at peace with it." Then he signed the form at exactly 10:47 p.m., shook the doctor's hand, and left the hospital like he'd just canceled a subscription. What my father didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that Patricia had been on shift that night and had seen him leave. She knew me, knew I'd updated my healthcare proxy specifically to keep my father out of medical decisions, and she knew something was wrong when she saw how calm he looked walking out of that ICU. She waited until her shift ended at 11 p.m., then went to the records department and pulled my employee file, found the proxy designation form I'd filled out 3 years earlier, and saw Deborah's name with a phone number. She called Deborah at 1:47 a.m., explained the situation, and said, "If you don't get here in the next hour, Rachel is going to die because her father chose money over her life." Deborah, who'd been my mentor during my first year as a nurse and had become like a second mother to me, drove through a rainstorm to get to that hospital. She walked into the ICU at 2:18 a.m., confronted the attending physician with my signed healthcare proxy, and said, "I'm revoking the DNR effective immediately, and I'm authorizing any and all interventions necessary to save her life." The doctor was relieved. He later told me he'd felt sick about the DNR, but had no legal grounds to overrule it. Within 20 minutes, I was prepped for surgery, and by 4 a.m. Dr. Mnai Patel was drilling into my skull to stop the bleeding that would have killed me by sunrise. My father found out I'd survived 3 days later when the hospital called to update him. And according to the nurse who made that call, his first question was, "Who authorized the surgery?" I woke up 21 days after the accident, and the first thing I saw was my father sitting next to my bed, holding my hand like he'd been there the whole time. He smiled when my eyes opened, called the nurse, and then leaned in close and whispered, "Thank God you made it, sweetheart." I never stopped praying. I was too weak to talk, too confused to process where I was or what had happened, but something about his voice felt wrong. It sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced that line in the mirror. Over the next few days, he visited every afternoon, brought me flowers, posted pictures of us on Facebook with captions like, "My strong daughter is fighting her way back," and told anyone who'd listen that he'd been my rock through the whole ordeal. But Patricia couldn't keep the truth from me forever, and 1 week after I woke up, she sat me down and told me everything: the DNR, the phone call to Deborah, the fact that my father had walked away and let me die. I didn't believe her at first. I thought maybe she'd misunderstood something, that there had to be a logical explanation. So she pulled out her phone and showed me the hospital records, the timestamps, the notes from Dr. Patel's file that said, "Father refused surgical consent, signed DNR at 10:47 p.m. She showed me the incident report she'd filed, the one that documented my father's exact words to the billing staff. "I'm not spending my retirement on someone who might not even be the same person when they wake up." I felt like I'd been hit by the truck all over again, except this time there was no ambulance, no one to shock me back to life, just this crushing weight of betrayal sitting on my chest. I asked Patricia why she'd saved me if my own father didn't want me alive, and she grabbed my hand so hard it hurt and said, "Because you're worth saving, Rachel, and I'll be damned if I let that man decide otherwise." I cried for the first time since waking up, not from physical pain but from the realization that the person who was supposed to protect me had calculated my worth in dollars and decided I wasn't worth the investment. But the story didn't end there, and what I didn't know yet, what nobody knew until Donald Kessler showed up, was that my father had done something far worse than signing a DNR. While I was unconscious, while Deborah was fighting to keep me alive, and Patricia was checking my vitals every hour, my father had gone to a notary in Tacoma with forged documents. He'd created a power of attorney that looked like I'd signed it, used it to transfer my grandmother's house into his name, and then taken out a $295,000 mortgage against that house to pay off his own debts. He'd stolen my inheritance, committed fraud, and used my coma as the perfect alibi. Kessler walked into my hospital room 6 weeks after I woke up, and I'll never forget the way he introduced himself. "Rachel, I'm Donald Kessler, and your grandmother hired me to make sure your father never got his hands on what she left you." He placed a folder on my lap and said, "Everything you need is in here. The original deed with your name on it, the timeline of the fraudulent transfer, the mortgage application with a forged signature, and a letter from Lillian explaining why she saw this coming." I opened that folder and saw my grandmother's handwriting on cream-colored stationery, and the first line made me gasp. "Rachel, if you're reading this, it means Richard has done exactly what I feared. He's tried to erase you by taking the one thing I could give you to stand on your own." Kessler explained that my grandmother had transferred the house to me 2 years before she died, that she'd recorded the deed with the county clerk to make it legally binding, and that she'd warned him my father would try something if I was ever vulnerable. She paid me a retainer and said, "If Rachel is ever incapacitated, if she's in an accident, if she's sick, if she's in any situation where Richard could claim authority over her, you find her and you stop him," Kessler said, his voice steady and certain. "That's exactly what I'm here to do. He pulled out copies of the fraudulent power of attorney, showed me where the notary had stamped it without verifying my signature, and explained that every transaction my father had made using that document was void, which meant the mortgage was fraudulent. The house was still mine, and my father had just committed multiple felonies. I could have gone to the police immediately, could have filed charges and watched my father get arrested in front of his church congregation, but I wanted something more. I wanted him to feel the same humiliation he'd made me feel my entire life. Kessler agreed, and together we built a strategy that would expose my father publicly, legally, and completely. We filed a motion to void the deed transfer, notified the mortgage company that the loan had been obtained through fraud, and submitted a police report with time-stamped evidence of forgery and identity theft. The bank had already flagged the mortgage as suspicious, and we had a 72-hour window before the funds were permanently distributed to creditors. We had to act fast. Then we waited, because I wanted the perfect moment to detonate his entire life, and that moment came 3 weeks later at the Shoreline Baptist Community Appreciation Dinner. My father had organized the event, one of those church fundraisers where local business owners and community leaders gather to celebrate service and integrity. He was set to give a speech, to stand at the podium in front of 130 people and talk about his commitment to faith and family. I bought a ticket, showed up in a wheelchair because I was still recovering, and sat in the back row with Kessler beside me. My father saw me, waved, probably thought I was there to support him, to play the role of the grateful daughter whose life he'd saved. He had no idea I was about to burn his reputation to ash. Halfway through dinner, my father took the microphone and started his speech. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and I want to share a story about what it means to fight for the people you love. He talked about my accident, about how he'd never left my side, about how he'd made difficult decisions to ensure I got the care I needed. He choked up, pretended to wipe away tears, and said, "There were moments I didn't think she'd make it, but I prayed, and God brought her back to me." The room was silent. People were nodding, some were crying, and I felt my blood turn to ice because I was watching him lie to everyone who trusted him. I raised my hand, and someone brought me a microphone. "Dad, can I say something?" I asked, my voice loud enough that the whole room turned to look at me. He froze, smiled nervously, and said, "Of course, sweetheart." I wheeled myself to the front of the room, and Kessler followed with a briefcase. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," I said, "because you're about to witness something my father calls faith and family values, but what I call the truth." I turned to face him, and his smile disappeared. "Dad, do you want to tell these people what you really did while I was in a coma? Or should I?" The room went dead silent. My father tried to take back the microphone, but I held it away from him and pulled out the first document, the DNR with his signature, and the timestamp showing he'd signed it after refusing surgery. This is a Do Not Resuscitate order that my father signed at 10:47 p.m. on October 14th, not because doctors said I was brain dead, but because the billing department told him I was too expensive. I heard gasps, saw people's faces change from confusion to horror. He told the hospital to let me die, walked out and didn't come back for 4 days. And I only survived because a friend found my healthcare proxy and called someone who actually valued my life. Then I pulled out the second document, the forged power of attorney and the fraudulent deed transfer. While I was unconscious, my father used a fake POA to steal the house my grandmother left me, transferred it into his name, and took out a $295,000 mortgage against it to pay off his credit cards and buy my sister a condo. Kessler stepped forward and handed me the mortgage application with the forged signature, and I held it up for the room to see. "This is fraud. This is identity theft. And this is what your deacon, your community leader, your man of integrity did while his daughter was fighting for her life." I turned back to my father, who was pale and shaking, and said, "The police report was filed this morning. The bank has frozen the mortgage, and the county is investigating the notary who helped you commit these crimes." 72 hours after I exposed my father at that church dinner, his entire life collapsed in a way that felt almost biblical. The bank froze the mortgage immediately, flagged the loan as fraudulent, and launched an internal investigation that would eventually lead to criminal referrals. The notary who'd stamped the fake power of attorney, a woman named Helen Vargas who worked out of a UPS store, admitted under questioning that my father had paid her $300 cash to notarize the document without verifying my identity. She lost her commission and faced charges of notarial misconduct. The county prosecutor's office opened a case for forgery, identity theft, and wire fraud. And suddenly my father went from respected deacon to defendant. But the legal consequences were only part of the karma. The social fallout was devastating. Within 24 hours of the dinner, someone had posted a video of my entire speech online, and it went viral in our community. The church board held an emergency meeting and removed my father from his position as deacon, citing conduct unbecoming of leadership and a betrayal of the trust placed in him by this congregation. His accounting clients, mostly small business owners who'd trusted him because of his church reputation, started canceling contracts. By the end of the week, he'd lost 60% of his client base. People who'd once smiled and shaken his hand at Sunday service now crossed the street to avoid him. The mortgage company filed a civil suit to recover the funds, demanding not just the $295,000 he'd borrowed, but also legal fees, penalties, and damages. My father tried to claim he'd taken the loan out for my medical bills, that he'd been acting in my best interest. But Kessler destroyed that defense by showing the bank statements: $18,000 to pay off his credit cards, $35,000 transferred to Natalie for her condo down payment, and the rest deposited into his personal account, with no medical payments made to any hospital or provider. The judge wasn't sympathetic, and the case moved toward a summary judgment that would leave my father financially ruined. His marriage didn't survive either. My mother, who'd spent 30 years enabling his cruelty and pretending not to notice how he treated me, finally had to face what he'd done in front of witnesses she couldn't ignore. She filed for divorce 6 weeks after the church dinner, and in the paperwork she cited irreconcilable differences and a pattern of financial deception that endangered the family. She didn't apologize to me, didn't reach out to see how I was recovering, but she did tell Natalie that she couldn't be married to a man who'd do that to his own child, which was the closest thing to accountability I ever got from her. My father tried to contact me several times, leaving voicemails where he oscillated between begging for forgiveness and blaming me for destroying his life over a misunderstanding. In one message, he said, "You're taking this too far, Rachel. I made a mistake, but you're making me lose everything." In another, he said, "I'm your father. You owe me respect, and you're humiliating me in front of people who looked up to me." I saved every voicemail, forwarded them to Kessler, and never responded, because the man who'd calculated whether I was worth saving based on a hospital bill didn't get to lecture me about respect or misunderstandings. The final blow came when the prosecutor's office offered him a deal: plead guilty to 1 count of forgery and 1 count of fraud, accept restitution terms, and avoid prison time with 5 years probation and community service. My father, who'd spent his entire life pretending to be morally superior, took the deal rather than face trial, which meant he had a criminal record and a public admission of guilt. He had to sell his house to pay the restitution, and the last I heard, he was living in a rental apartment in Everett, working part-time at a tax preparation office and attending a different church where nobody knew his name. Natalie, my sister, stayed silent through the entire church dinner, the investigation, and the legal proceedings. But 3 months after everything came out, she showed up at my door unannounced. She looked smaller somehow, like the weight of her complicity had physically diminished her, and she didn't even try to hug me when I opened the door. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice flat and exhausted. I let her in, made tea I didn't drink, and waited for her to say whatever she'd come to say. She sat on my grandmother's couch, the couch that was back in the house that was legally mine again, and said, "I knew about the DNR. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't say anything. Just let the silence stretch until she had to fill it. Dad called me the night he signed it," she continued, staring at her hands. "He said you were in bad shape, that the surgery was expensive, that maybe it was better to let nature take its course. I told him that sounded wrong, that he should wait and see what the doctors said, but I didn't call anyone. I didn't drive to the hospital. I didn't do anything to stop him. She looked up at me, and her eyes were red but dry, like she'd already cried all the tears she had. I should have called Deborah myself. I should have made sure you had someone fighting for you, but I didn't, and I'm so sorry. I wanted to scream at her, to ask how she could have known and stayed silent. But instead, I just asked the question I'd been wondering since Kessler showed me the bank statements. Did you know about the house too? She nodded, and my stomach dropped. He told me he needed to access Grandma's estate to cover your medical bills, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him, she said, her voice cracking. He said once you recovered, he'd transfer it back, that it was just temporary, and I thought he was doing something noble. I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised both of us. And the $35,000 he gave you for your condo, did you think that was noble too? Natalie flinched like I'd slapped her. He told me it was part of my inheritance, that Grandma had wanted us both to have something, and I didn't question it because I'd spent my whole life being told I deserved more than you. She was crying now, finally, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, just this vast emptiness where my relationship with my sister used to be. I know you hate me, she said, and I don't blame you. But I need you to know that I didn't understand what he was doing until it was too late, and I'm trying to figure out how to live with that. I sat there for a long time, thinking about all the years I'd watched Natalie get everything while I got the receipts. All the times she'd accepted the privileges my father gave her without asking why I didn't get the same. I don't hate you, I finally said, but I don't forgive you either. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She nodded like she'd expected that. Did you give the money back? I asked, and she shook her head. I used it for the down payment. I can't undo that without selling the condo, but I can pay you back over time if you'll let me. I thought about it, about whether I wanted to tie my recovery to her guilt payments, and decided I didn't. Keep the money, I said. Consider it the price you paid to learn who our father really is. Natalie stayed for another hour, and we talked about our childhood, about how she'd seen the way he treated me but hadn't understood the depth of it, about how she was in therapy now trying to unpack her role in the family dynamic. She asked if we could rebuild our relationship, if there was a path forward where we could be sisters again, and I told her the truth. Maybe, but not right now, and not on his terms. She accepted that, hugged me before she left, a real hug, not a performative one, and said, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve a second chance. I watched her drive away and realized I didn't feel angry anymore, just tired. Tired of carrying the weight of my father's cruelty, tired of measuring my worth in the ways I'd been hurt, tired of letting his betrayal define every relationship I had. Natalie's confession didn't erase what she'd done, but it cracked open a door I thought I'd welded shut. And maybe someday, when I was ready, when she'd proven through actions and not just words that she understood the damage, we'd walk through it together. The house is mine now, legally and completely. The deed is in my name. The mortgage fraud case is closed, and the title is clear of any claims my father tried to make. I moved in 4 months after the church dinner, after the last of the legal paperwork was finalized, and Kessler handed me the keys with a smile that said he'd kept his promise to my grandmother. The first night I spent there, I sat on the porch swing my grandma and I used to share, and I felt her presence so strongly I almost turned to look for her. I whispered, "Thank you," into the dark, and I swear I felt the wind shift like she was answering. My father accepted the plea deal, paid the restitution by selling his house and liquidating his retirement account, and now he's living a quiet, diminished life in a town where nobody knows him. He sent me one final letter, not an apology, but a justification, where he wrote, "I hope someday you'll understand that I did what I thought was right at the time, and that you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." I burned that letter in the fireplace and watched the smoke carry his words away. Forgiveness isn't something I owe him, and peace isn't something I need to earn by absolving the man who tried to let me die. Patricia still checks on me, calls every week to see how I'm healing, and she's told me more than once that saving my life was the proudest moment of her career. Deborah comes over for dinner once a month, and we sit in the kitchen and talk about nursing, about life, about how strange it is that the system worked because people broke the rules for the right reasons. They're the family I chose, the ones who valued my life when biology said I wasn't worth the cost. And I'm learning that chosen family can be stronger than blood when blood is poisoned. I went back to work 6 months after the accident, eased back into 12-hour shifts and trauma cases, and every time I see a patient in crisis, I think about how close I came to being a DNR statistic. I'm more vigilant now, more willing to question family members who seem more concerned about bills than outcomes, more likely to pull a healthcare proxy when something feels off. I've saved 2 lives by doing exactly what Patricia did for me, finding the person who actually values the patient and putting them in charge of decisions. The scars from the accident are still there, physical and emotional, but they're not the most important part of my story anymore. What matters is that I survived, that I reclaimed what my grandmother wanted me to have, that I stood up in front of a room full of people and told the truth, even when it was humiliating and hard. What matters is that I learned the difference between revenge and justice, between bitterness and boundaries, between carrying anger and carrying dignity. I'm 32 now, living in the house my grandmother left me, building a life that isn't measured in debt or guilt or what I cost anyone. I plant lavender in the garden because it smells like peace. I host dinners for the people who fought for me. And I wake up every morning knowing that I don't owe my existence an apology. My father thought he could erase me to save money, but instead he erased himself, and I'm still here, alive, free, and finally worth exactly what I've always been worth, which is everything. So that's my story. The DNR, the fraud, the public exposure, and the justice that followed. But here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever had to set a boundary with family that everyone else thought was too harsh? Have you been made to feel guilty for protecting yourself from someone who hurt you? Drop a comment below and tell me your story, because I know I'm not the only one who's had to choose between keeping the peace and reclaiming their dignity. And if you've ever been the expensive kid, the one who was treated like a burden instead of a blessing, I see you, and you deserved better. I also want to ask you this. Do you think my sister deserves a second chance? Or should I have cut her off completely? Was I right to expose my father publicly? Or should I have handled it privately? These are the questions I wrestle with, and I'd love to hear your perspective, especially if you've navigated family betrayal and the messy aftermath of setting boundaries. Your comments help me process this, and they help others who are going through something similar feel less alone. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own family dynamics or the price of self-worth, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I share stories like this, real, raw, and unfiltered, because I believe we heal when we stop pretending that family is perfect and start talking about what it really costs to survive the people who were supposed to love us. There's more to come, more truths to uncover, and I want you here for every revelation. Let's keep this conversation going, because the world needs to hear that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival.